This is a lecture on biodiversity. So the first part of this lecture is showing you a really quick video about what we call the Anthropocene, which is the time period that we're in right now. So the topics that we'll be covering for this lecture, first of all, is what is biodiversity? So we'll look at a definition and the different types of biodiversity, speciation and biodiversity, its value, threats to biodiversity, and conservation. So I put your learning objectives at the beginning of each section, but they are also on the first page of your module. So for the first section, what is biodiversity? Your learning objectives are to describe the 3 types of biodiversity, and I also want you to be able to provide an example of each type. And as I go through the information, I will kind of indicate what I mean by that. I would like you to explain the concept of species richness and also why insects are the most abundant group of organisms on Earth. So first of all, this of course is my favorite slide because it has bees on it, which are what I study as part of ecology. So let's talk about biodiversity. There are essentially 3 different definitions for biodiversity. The first one being species richness. So I put the definition under the term species richness. So that refers to the number of species in a given habitat. Now, really quick, just to give you the definition of a species, it is a group of organisms within a given habitat that interbreed with one another. At least that is one definition of a species. We call that the biological definition. So in other words, we call like different types of bees. For instance, they're under E, that shiny green bee. That is like an orchid bee. Actually, I'm sorry, that one is a leaf cutter bee. So that would be one species of bee. Whereas like if you look at bee, that tiny little yellow bee, which by the way, we find that in Arizona, all of these bees are found in Arizona, but that little tiny yellow bee is a different species of bee. Now the green bee and the yellow bee do not interbreed. Therefore, we call them different species. Now, this is along the same lines as species richness. So basically, we group all of life into 3 large groups that we call domains. We have bacteria, which includes all the different types of bacteria. We have archaea, which you probably haven't heard of, but it's really unique single-celled organisms that live in like the deep sea thermal vents. And then we have eukarya, which is what you are most familiar with, and that's plants, animals, fungi, this weird group called protists. So what I want you to see here is there's about 5 to 50 million species of organisms on the planet. Now, the reason it's such a big range, right, is we have not actually found all of these species. We're just assuming that there are a lot of species we have not found. Now, keep in mind that a great number of those are bacteria. So my question on this slide is, why do we know more about plants and animals than single-celled organisms such as bacteria? So I want you to pause the video and take a second to think about that. So basically, studying plants and animals is much easier than studying bacteria. Remember, you can't see bacteria with the naked eye. So how would you study, say, soil bacteria? There are tons and tons of different kinds of bacteria that live in the soil, or say the ocean. The ocean has a lot of different types of bacteria as well. So there are different ways to study bacteria, but they're all a lot more difficult than going out and, say, studying elephants, right? Those are pretty easy to spot. So that is why we know a lot more about plants and animals than bacteria. And also, it's easier to get funding from the government or to get donations to study, say, elephants than it is to study some obscure little single-celled organism that lives in the soil. So that's also why we have a lot more information on plants and animals. Now, what I want you to notice with this slide is, okay, this is looking at this pie chart. If you take all the organisms on Earth, this pie chart is showing you how many of those organisms belong to each group, right? So what I want you to notice here is insects are by far the biggest group of organisms. They're the most abundant and the most diverse. And what I mean by diverse is the largest number of species, right? So the question asks you, why are insects the most abundant group? Now, it's not that I care that you remember necessarily that it's insects, but what I want you to realize here is insects live in so many different types of habitats, right? If you take just like one tree in the rainforest, you will have beetles that live way up in the canopy and different types of insects that live in the middle region of the tree, different types of insects that live in the lower area and in the soil. So insects are so diverse and abundant because they can make use of all these different habitats. And that is a major concept in biodiversity, is that when you have a lot of different habitats in an area, you're going to have a more biodiverse group, meaning greater number of species. Now, another definition of biodiversity is genetic diversity. So this picture here has two mice, old field mice, and they're in the same population, but notice that one is white with a little brown, the other one is fully brown. Now that comes from genetic variation, right? There's a gene that controls fur color, and the white mouse has one version of the gene and the brown mouse has another. They both have the gene for hair color, but they have different versions. So why is that important? Why do we need genetic diversity? Well, one of the most important reasons, let's take corn, for instance. Here in the US, we just grow the big yellow corn that you're used to looking at. But if you go a long time ago, there are what we call land races of corn. That means like natural corn that was out in the environment that indigenous peoples used a long time ago. Now we have most of those land races in Mexico. They've preserved a lot of them. But here in the US, we just have that big yellow ear of corn. Now, if there is an insect that is really good at preying on that corn, right? Say the caterpillars eat up all the kernels. If we have all the same type of corn, all of our crops are vulnerable to that insect. But if we had a lot of different types of corn, there might be some types of corn that are resistant to the insect. Maybe they produce a chemical the insect doesn't like. Okay, so if we have a greater variety, genetic diversity, then we have a better chance of maintaining populations even when there are changes to the environment. Now, the final definition of biodiversity is ecosystem diversity. Now, I wrote here, each type of habitat provides a living environment for different types of species. So when I'm talking about ecosystem diversity, if you look at the picture here, desert is one type of ecosystem. The one that's next to that is a Mediterranean habitat. Here I have a pine forest, and you can't see because my video's in the way, there we go, we have a coral reef. These are all different types of ecosystems. And it's really important that we support these ecosystems because they all have different types of organisms living there. So take, for instance, in the US, we used to have prairies, right, like the Great Plains, grasslands, but have largely been destroyed for agriculture. So we lost a bunch of species that live in grasslands. So if we go back to our learning objective, there it is. Describe the three types of biodiversity. Well, there is species richness, genetic diversity, and ecosystem diversity. And I put provide an example of each. So for species richness, you could answer the question as, take for instance, the Sonoran Desert has over 1,000 different species of bees. Okay, that is an example of a lot of species richness. Genetic diversity, I gave you the example with the corn. Ecosystem diversity, a coral reef has all these different places for like fish and things to hide, right? So it's very diverse. It supports a lot of different organisms. Now, what I recommend you do before the quiz is look up examples or get it in your mind what you want to use for examples as you study this. So let's go on to the next topic, which is speciation and biodiversity. So you will need to be able to define speciation, and then you will have to be able to provide an example of speciation and how that leads to an increase in biodiversity. Okay. Okay. So first of all, let's talk about what this term speciation means. Now, if you think back, way back in geologic time, we all have a common ancestor, that original cell that formed on Earth. We all came from this first cell. Okay, the cell is the smallest unit of life. Okay, a single cell can be living, just like bacteria. Now, from this single cell, all of the diversity you see on Earth came from that cell. Okay, so that is a form of speciation. So let me give you an official definition. Speciation occurs when a common ancestor develops or evolves into different species, right? You have a common ancestor, it evolved into multiple species. Now, that doesn't mean the common ancestor itself like changes. Okay, so like for instance, whales have evolved from what we call ungulates, which are hoofed animals. Okay, so it's not saying that like a deer became a whale. That's not how it works. But a long time ago, you had a animal with a hoof, and that like populations of that animal started to evolve through natural selection until different types of animals resulted. Now, here in my picture, I have an illustration of what is called allopatric speciation. This is one type of speciation, and it is based on natural selection. Now, just as a refresher, natural selection occurs in a population. Okay, so individuals in the population that are better adapted to their environment, that are better suited for their environment, they produce more offspring, passing on their genetic traits until over many, many, many generations, a lot of the organisms in that population have that trait. So let's apply that to speciation. I don't know if you can see my cursor in the video, but here we have the original population. Okay, so I'm going to give you an example from California. There's two different types of salamanders, right? Um, there's a type that lives kind of in the inner area called the Central Valley, and a type that lives on the outer area. So originally there was a salamander that was the ancestor of these other two. Okay, so you have your original population of the salamander. Then all of a sudden, for some reason, a geographic barrier forms. Now, think geographic means like what? Like mountains, things like that. And that is exactly what I'm talking about. So let's picture this. We have our original population of, say, brown salamanders, and they're living in like a pond, or they're, you know, living in like a creek, something like that. And something happens that separates that population into two populations. So let's say if they were in a creek and there's another creek over here, they go back and forth, and all of a sudden it dries up so that they can no longer reach each other. That would be geographic barrier. So it's anything that separates a population into two populations and they can no longer interact with each other. Okay, it could be like a lake drying up. It could be urbanization, right? Like building a city or building housing or something that separates a population into two. So any of those are geographic barriers. It's any physical barrier that separates a population into two separate populations. Now, reproductive isolation, all that means is that the two populations of, say, salamander, they cannot reach each other to mate. Okay, now what's going to happen on either side of this geographic barrier is these two populations will start to adapt to their new environment. And that is natural selection. Okay, so if we have a brown salamander population originally, it gets split into half. What if this new population, half of the population, their environment changes and brown is no longer a good color for those salamanders? And out pops, say, an orange salamander. If an orange salamander is better adapted to its environment, it's more like it camouflages better, or maybe it warns off predators better. It will live longer, make more offspring, and over many, many generations, that population of salamanders will be mostly orange. Okay, now, once these populations change so much that if you were to actually put them back together, they wouldn't mate that way either, then they are new species. So if I have my brown salamander population that's split into two, through natural selection, one of those populations turns into orange salamanders over many, many generations. If the orange salamanders and the brown salamander populations were to get back together and they no longer mate, they no longer recognize each other as the same group, then they are considered different species. So you started with one group, one species, splits into two. Now, over time, you have two species. That is how speciation has led to greater biodiversity. As the environment on Earth changes, as geographic barriers arise, you end up getting more and more species. Okay, common ancestor, populations break off, they change through natural selection until they are no longer the same species. So you will need to be able to provide a definition of speciation and an example. And if my salamander example was confusing, make sure you look up one on your own. Now, this video I really like. I'm not going to show it on my lecture video. You need to go back and watch it on your own. So in Africa, there are fish called cichlids. Now, there were originally two species of cichlid, and over many, many generations, now there are over 700 species, all of which evolved from those original two species. So watch this video and it will explain how that happened. And this actually could further reinforce that concept of speciation. Now, I really want you to watch these videos, so I will be asking you a quiz question on this video. Okay, so far we went over the three types of biodiversity: species richness, genetic diversity, and ecosystem diversity. And then we talked about how speciation increases biodiversity. So now we're going to talk about the value of biodiversity. So you will need to describe an example from the following categories that I gave you here. And I'll show you a slide with that. And then I want you to talk about ecosystem services and provide 3 examples of that as well. Okay. So on your learning objective, I told you that I wanted you to provide an example of these different values of biodiversity. So basically, up on top here, we have human well-being. And what that means is we are dependent on biodiversity. So first of all, biodiversity gives us provisioning services. And what that means is like things that we can use to live like a certain standard of living, right? So food, fuel, water, medicine. A lot of our medicine comes from different plants and insects, surprisingly, all over, all different types of organisms we use to get medicine. We originally isolate the chemical and then we make it, sorry, I knocked something over. We make it synthetically in the lab, right? But we need those organisms to isolate the chemicals originally for our medications. So provisioning is basically giving us products, right? Let's go down from there. Regulating services. So climate, floods, erosion, pests. Regulating services is how biodiversity can keep these other things in check, keep them in equilibrium, right? Now we are undergoing climate change, and that is partly because of how we are disrupting our ecosystems, partly. Regulating services like regulating floods. For instance, if you think about like Hurricane Katrina, which was a few years ago, but it flooded into New Orleans, right? That is because we removed all of the wetlands around the coast. So when there are severe storms and the ocean starts washing in, usually the wetlands take in a lot of that water and also slow down the flow. But without wetlands, you're going to see catastrophic flooding. And pests. So that means like crop pests, right? For instance, in Africa right now, they're having a huge locust plague, meaning like, I guess the locusts are, there's so many of them that they can devour a crop overnight. So these types of things happen because biodiversity and our ecosystems are kind of thrown out of equilibrium. Now we have supporting services, soil formation, nutrients, habitats. So those support like soil formation, for instance, supports crops, right? Crop growth. Nutrients support like all life on Earth. Even plants need nutrients, everything needs nutrients. And then finally, if you go up into the right-hand corner, we have cultural services, and that applies to humans, right? But we get aesthetic value from biodiversity and primarily recreation. Okay, so if you go, let's say you like to fish, and you go out to a lake, It's great if there are a lot of different type of fish out there, right? So biodiversity um, encourages recreation. So you need to be able to have an example for these four categories. You don't have to know how everything relates to one another, but at least have examples. I talked to you, or I didn't talk to you, but I showed you a learning objective about ecosystem services. So that is what this slide is showing you. So ecosystem services are services provided by a biodiverse ecosystem that we depend on for human life. Okay, so let me repeat that for you. Ecosystem services are services provided by a biodiverse ecosystem that we humans depend on for life. So for instance, pollination, my favorite, as you know, we rely on pollination. Now, bees are the most prolific or efficient pollinators. 30% of the food that you eat comes from plants that are pollinated by bees. Now, in China, for instance, they have very few pollinators left because of pollution and various other things. They have to actually go out and hand pollinate their crops. So that means like taking the pollen off one plant, and pollen has sperm, and putting it on the female parts of another plant so that fruit can form. That is what pollination gives us. It gives us fruit. Let's see here. So let's look at erosion prevention. So erosion is when like rainwater or like rivers or creeks, they start to wear away at the banks, at the soil, and wash the soil away. Erosion is a huge problem, even for crops, right? You get like rainfall, it depletes the soil, takes like the healthy layer off, and then we can't grow our crops. Now, erosion prevention comes from having a biodiverse plant community. Plants hold the soil together so that it does not get washed away. Without biodiverse plant communities, we are going to lose the ability to grow crops. So these are all ecosystem services. So make sure that you have at least 3 examples that you can describe about ecosystem services. So if I ask you a short answer question, you cannot just put pollination, erosion prevention. I want you to explain it. What do you mean by pollination as an ecosystem service? Well, it supports the growth of food, which we rely on. Okay, now we have threats to biodiversity. So just to review, you have the 3 types of biodiversity, which was species richness, ecosystem diversity, and genetic diversity, right? And we also talked about speciation and biodiversity, so how you get many species from a common ancestor. And remember, natural selection is most often involved in speciation. And then we talked about the value of biodiversity, all these different services that we get from a biodiverse ecosystem, supporting, provisioning, cultural. Now we're talking about threats to biodiversity. So I put here that you need to describe the threats outlined or provided in the video that I've put in here and the illustration, and provide one example for each threat. Now remember, an example doesn't mean one word, it means a description. And when I say things like provide an example, I'm generally talking about giving you a short answer question. Okay, so my first slide here, threats to biodiversity. Well, one important thing to realize, so this image on the left here is looking at mass extinctions, which you may have heard of. The eradication of dinosaurs was a mass extinction. Now we've had 5 mass extinctions in geologic history, but we are on our 6th mass extinction right now. The other 5 were caused by changes in the environment. The sixth one is caused by humans, almost entirely by humans. So if you look at the right side here, in the next 5 centuries, 75% of the species inhabiting Earth will be extinct if we continue treating the environment like we do now. So this is an area of major concern. Now here, this says current extinction rates are 100 to 1,000 times greater than background rates. So background rate, I mean, species are always going extinct, right? Just naturally. And natural extinction rates are what we call background rates. But the extinctions that we're seeing now are so much faster. They are happening at such a higher rate than has been seen throughout all of geologic history. And that is very alarming and is an indication that humans are causing these extinctions. Now, this is the video I was talking about. This is David Attenborough. He's like a huge, he did all of like the animal documentary, stuff like that. But this is a really good video. It features several different scientists talking about extinctions right now, but also what you can do to prevent the further loss of biodiversity. So you need to watch this video, and I will ask you at least one quiz question from it. Now, over here on the left, these are the 6 biggest threats to biodiversity. Now, don't just count on this illustration to answer a question. You have to watch this video. It has slightly different information. But the 6 biggest threats to biodiversity, climate change is a huge one. A lot of different organisms cannot adapt to climate change. For instance, as it gets warmer and warmer, it's changing when plants bloom, right? So bees are emerging from the ground. Most bees nest in the ground. They're emerging, but there's no plants for them. There's like no flowers for them to feed off. So we are seeing a huge die-off of bees. Habitat loss and degradation. The major cause of habitat loss is urban development. Now, we call it urban sprawl, and to get an idea of what urban sprawl is, all you have to do is drive around the Phoenix area. What is it called? Anthem. Anthem is a huge example of urban sprawl, and a lot of environmentalists tried to prevent this development from being undertaken or completed because it is destroying natural desert. So what, as an environmentalist or an ecologist, what we like to see is building up, not out, right? Let's concentrate our development into the central parts of the city so that people don't have to move into these fringes and destroy more of the habitat and the ecosystem. Pollution is a huge problem, right? Pollution, and the video goes into it as well, especially in other countries, not all other countries, but one of the reasons we have moved a lot of our production out of the US and into, say, Mexico and other areas is because they have fewer environmental regulations, because environmental regulations cost companies money, right? They have to set up ways of not polluting the environment. But if they go to a developing country or an area with very few regulations, they can produce their goods cheaper. Invasive species, those are species that end up in an area where they are not normally located, where they did not evolve. Let me think of a good invasive species. There is a cane toad, right? It's this huge toad, and it was introduced to Australia from, let's see, I think it was originally in like Hawaii or something, to eat these beetles that were destroying sugarcane fields. The problem is the beetles are in the ground while they develop, then they emerge from the ground and fly up into the sugarcane. So the toads never actually encounter them. However, these toads have spread across all of Australia. They eat natural wildlife. They eat rodents, snakes, everything, other amphibians. This is an invasive species. When you take an organism out of where it evolved and you put it somewhere new, It generally does not have predators. And so it just multiplies and multiplies until it's out of control. Overexploitation, they're going to show you that in the video. The best example I can think of is our ocean ecosystem. So I'm sure some of you enjoy seafood or just fish, right? We are depleting the ocean of fish, believe it or not. And some people have predicted that years from now, all that's going to be left are like jellyfish. So, like I said, watch this video and make sure that you have an example that you can explain for each of these threats to biodiversity. I like this quote. So Jane Goodall is one of my well, she's pretty much my idol. She's one of the reasons why I got into being an ecologist. She studies chimpanzees in Africa. She was one of the first women to go and do research on her own. And she has been a huge advocate for ecosystem conservation, but also animal rights issues, right? She's gone around to all these different medical research labs and advocated for better conditions for the lab animals. She's really awesome. So she writes, I believe the only hope for mankind lies in the hands of our young people. And I cannot agree more. We have to start educating our kids on how to be, I guess, better members of the ecosystem. Okay, the final part of this lecture is conservation. How do we conserve biodiversity? We know what biodiversity is now. We know how important it is. We know what threatens it, but how do we conserve it? So for your learning objective, you will have to be able to tell me the difference between in situ and ex situ conservation and provide 2 examples of each. So these are the official definitions from the Convention on Biological Diversity, which was an international meeting. So in situ is the conservation of ecosystems and natural habitats and the maintenance and recovery of viable populations of species in their natural surroundings. Well, that's a very long definition with a few terms you probably don't know. Viable population means that there are enough individuals to keep the population going through breeding. Right? If it is not a viable population, if you just have, say, 100 individuals of, I don't know, with cheetahs, for instance, they're going to get inbred and they will have various health issues. And that actually is true for cheetahs. So viable population means that the individuals breed, keep the population going without a lot of inbreeding. But basically, in situ conservation means that we conserve organisms in their own habitat, like we protect a forest or a certain ecosystem, and that protects all the organisms in it. So in situ, in their natural habitat. And I'll give you a few examples in a second. Ex situ means outside of the natural habitat. So the conservation of components of biological diversity outside their natural habitat. So the best example of this is like captive breeding programs. And zoos are implemental in this. Now, I'm not a huge lover of zoos, but they're great for education, and a lot of them have really strong captive breeding programs. Take the San Diego Zoo, for instance. They've done a lot to breed pandas and reintroduce them to the wild. So here are your examples in situ within an organism's habitat. Here's where we normally do protected areas: national parks, sanctuary, reserves. It's the sacred forests and lakes. I think that just means like conserving areas that are sacred to like indigenous peoples. Ex situ, you are conserving organisms outside of their natural habitat. So, like seed banks, right? We're storing a bunch of seeds so that if we ever need these different types of plants in the future, we will have the seeds. Long term captive breeding. So, take the Phoenix Zoo. I don't know if you've ever seen the Arabian oryx, but it's kind of like a antelope kind of thing with these really long spirally horns. um, it was almost eradicated in the Middle East. It almost went extinct. The Phoenix Zoo got, I can't remember how much originally, like 50 animals. And from that group, they have managed to bring the population or the species back from the brink of extinction. And they've released a lot of them back into the wild. We have, let's see here, cryopreservation of gametes and embryos. Basically, that just means that we are preserving sperm and eggs of different organisms by freezing them. Not like freezing in the freezer, but like that cryogenic type freezing. Okay, so that's what we're doing with like the white rhinos that are almost extinct. I think there's only like, I want to say like one female or two females left, but we've frozen sperm from some of the last male white rhinos before they died. Botanical gardens is obviously focused on plants, but we have a lot of different plants that we can conserve and propagate or make more of them, right? Outside of their natural habitat. So if there's like a lot of logging or urbanization in an area, we can take those plants, put them in a botanical garden, and keep the species going with the hope that we can someday reintroduce them to the wild and establish wild populations. I believe this is my last slide. Oh no, I have two more. This is the Pacific fisher. Now, it's kind of like a weasel type of thing. So the Pacific fisher was almost pushed to extinction by logging, and I believe it's in the Pacific Northwest in the US. Now, we started doing captive breeding of the fisher, and now we have very strong population in these forests again. And of course, you've probably heard of the gray wolf. Again, we almost killed all of them because we were trying to protect cattle ranching. But we kept enough, and through captive breeding, we have been able to reintroduce a pretty good sized group back into the wild. And so they're starting to become established. We've seen them breeding. So it's a really positive outlook for the gray wolf. So this concludes the biodiversity lecture. And like I said, make sure you go back and watch the videos and that you can actually explain these examples that I have asked you for, because some of the short answer questions in your quiz will be based on that. I could also give you scenarios and you have to be able to build on it, right? So if I give you a scenario of, I don't know, a loss of biodiversity, you would have to tell me why it occurred, something like that. So you have to know the information well enough to apply it to certain like scenarios or situations.